Hello everyone, welcome to 10-Minute Physiology. In this video, I am going to try to explain what the driving force is in less than 10 minutes. So let's give it a go. So let's bring up a hypothetical cell. This hypothetical cell has a plasma membrane that separates two fluid compartments, the intracellular fluid and the interstitial fluid. The interstitial fluid is the fluid outside of the cell, and the intracellular fluid is the fluid inside the cell. Inside the cell, we have only one solute, and this solute is potassium. And outside the cell, we only have one solute, and this solute is also potassium. Now, the concentration of potassium inside the cell is much greater than the potassium concentration outside the cell. Now, in the plasma membrane of this hypothetical cell, we have a potassium channel, and when this potassium channel is open, it will allow potassium ions to flow through it. Now, because potassium is a cation and therefore has a positive charge, and since we have more potassium inside the cell than outside the cell, the inside of the cell will be positively charged, and the outside of the cell will be relatively negative. And once again, this is because we have more potassium inside than outside, and since potassium has a positive charge, the inside of the cell will be relatively more positive than the outside of the cell. Now, because of this, we will have two gradients working on the potassium ions when we open this channel. The first gradient is the electrical gradient, and the electrical gradient will favor the movement of potassium from the inside of the cell to the outside. And the reason why is because the positive charges inside the cell will repel potassium ions, causing them to flow through this channel into the outside of the cell, which is negatively charged. So the positive charge inside the cell and the negative charge outside of the cell work together in order to draw potassium from the inside to the outside. The second gradient is going to be the concentration gradient. And the concentration gradient is going to favor the movement of potassium from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. And the reason why is because the concentration of potassium inside the cell is much greater than the concentration of potassium outside. Now, if we were to combine these two gradients together, we would see that the driving force on this ion would cause the ion to move out of the cell. And this is seen right when we open that channel. Now, in order to explain the movement of this ion much better, we are going to use a specific term called the driving force. However, in order to understand the driving force, we have to take into account two factors. The first is going to be the Nernst equation. Remember that the Nernst equation is used to calculate the equilibrium potential. And the equilibrium potential is the cell membrane potential at which the ion is in equilibrium. So in other words, the amount of ion going into the cell is going to equal the amount of ion going out of the cell. And we can calculate the equilibrium potential by using the Nernst equation. I have another video in my channel explaining the Nernst equation in much more detail. Go check it out if you have any questions. So the second factor that we have to take into account is the membrane potential. And the membrane potential can be described by this equation here. And basically what this equation is telling us is that the membrane potential is a weighted average of all of the equilibrium potentials of the ions present. So in other words, what this equation is telling us is the more permeable the ion is to the cell membrane, the greater the contribution that ion has to the membrane potential. So for example, since there are more ion channels for potassium open than sodium in a cell, the resting membrane potential will tend to be closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium than sodium. I go over the membrane potential in much more detail in another video in my channel, so if you are confused about that, please go check it out. So the driving force is going to take the membrane potential and the equilibrium potential into account. And by definition, the driving force is the difference between the membrane potential and the equilibrium potential for that ion. So each ion will have its own driving force. So what does this driving force actually tell us? Well, the driving force is going to tell us how an ion will move when an ion channel is open. So it's going to tell us the direction that ion will move when the channel is open. So knowing the driving force will tell us whether an ion will move out of the cell or into the cell when a channel is open. And this driving force is incredibly important to understand because the driving force is going to be the backbone of many other important physiological concepts. This is going to include action potentials, so how nerves fire. This is going to be important for excitation, contraction, coupling, which is going to explain how muscles contract. It's going to be important for understanding how the heart beats. It's going to be important for synaptic transmission and many other things. So the driving force is an incredibly important topic to understand. In order to understand the driving force better, I would like you to do this example. So this example is going to ask you to calculate the driving force. So in this example, we are going to have a cell. And this cell is going to have sodium outside of it. So there's a certain concentration of sodium outside the cell and a certain sodium concentration inside the cell. And there is also going to be a sodium channel. And when the sodium channel is open, it will allow sodium to flow through it. Now the concentration of sodium outside the cell is going to be 150 millimolar, and the concentration of sodium inside the cell is going to be 15 millimolar. And the membrane potential of this cell is going to be negative 70 millivolts. So what I would like you to do is to pause the video and to calculate what the driving force on sodium will be. So please pause the video and try it for yourself and come back when you are done. So hopefully you calculated the driving force on sodium in this example. And when you go through the math, the first thing that we have to do is to calculate what the equilibrium potential is of sodium. And we use the Nernst equation in order to do that. And when you plug in all the values into the Nernst equation, what you should get is that the equilibrium potential for sodium is going to be plus 60 millivolts. So next what we are going to do is now we can calculate the driving force. And we can calculate the driving force by using this equation, which I showed to you before. And what you do is you will take the membrane potential and put that here, the equilibrium potential and put that here, and take the difference between them. And what you should get is a driving force of negative 130 millivolts. So what exactly is this saying? Well, this is saying that we have a negative driving force. So in other words, there is a strong negative voltage pulling the sodium ions from the extracellular environment to the intracellular environment. It is basically telling us that there is a strong tendency of sodium to flow from the extracellular to the intracellular environment. And this is due to the negative voltage acting upon it from inside the cell. So therefore, when this sodium channel opens, the sodium will flow through this channel from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. So therefore, we can use this driving force in order to determine how an ion will move through an open channel. When the driving force is positive, so when you have a positive driving force, when you calculate it, cations, or positively charged ions, will move out of the cell, and this is because like repels like. And anions will move into the cell, and this is because opposite charges attract. When the driving force is negative, cations, or positively charged ions, will move into the cell. This is because opposite charges attract. And anions will move out of the cell, and this is because like charges repel. So therefore, this driving force is incredibly important to understand in order to understand how ions will move when a channel is open. So hopefully this gives you a good explanation of what the driving force is. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.